The scene itself told a confusing story. There were no clear signs of forced entry that would indicate a stranger breaking in with violent intent. There were no indications of a prolonged struggle that would suggest Nancy fought back against her attacker. What investigators found instead were pieces that didn't fit together in the way they typically do in abduction cases. The physical evidence suggested that whoever took Nancy Guthrie either knew how to control a situation without leaving obvious traces, or had some level of familiarity that allowed them access without raising immediate alarm. By the time we reached day 79, the FBI had become deeply involved. Their presence alone tells us something significant. The Federal Bureau of Investigation doesn't take over every missing person case. Their jurisdiction typically requires specific circumstances, evidence of kidnapping, indication of interstate activity, or situations involving federal crimes. The fact that they were leading the investigation meant that law enforcement had classified this as more than a simple disappearance. Then came the ransom letters, 2 of them, sent not to Nancy's family through private channels, not to law enforcement through established communication methods, but to television stations in Phoenix. Brianna Whitney, a reporter with the CBS affiliate in that city, received one of these communications. The content included something that would become central to the entire investigation: information about a Bitcoin wallet. Now, ransom demands have evolved with technology. Kidnappers no longer need to arrange cash drops in public locations where law enforcement can set up surveillance. Cryptocurrency offers a different kind of anonymity, a way to potentially collect payment without the physical risks that come with traditional ransom exchanges. So finding Bitcoin information in a ransom letter isn't necessarily unusual in modern cases. What was unusual is everything that happened next, or more accurately, everything that didn't happen. Savannah Guthrie made a public statement that would later take on significant meaning. She indicated that she believed 2 of the ransom notes were real and legitimate, not speculation, not hoaxes, not the kind of cruel messages that unfortunately surface in high-profile cases when opportunistic individuals try to exploit family tragedy. She believed that at least 2 of the communications came from someone genuinely connected to her mother's disappearance. That assessment matters. It matters because it suggests that despite all the strange elements in this case, despite all the ways this situation diverged from typical kidnapping patterns, there was something in those letters that convinced a daughter. They were authentic. We don't know what specific details created that conviction. We don't know what evidence the letters contained that hasn't been made public. But we know that Savannah Guthrie, working closely with federal investigators, believed the communication was real. Which brings us to February 10th. Roughly 2 months into Nancy's disappearance, someone checked the Bitcoin wallet that had been included in those ransom letters, and they found something. Not a large transaction indicating ransom payment, not a series of communications showing ongoing negotiation. They found a small deposit, an amount of money so minimal that it clearly wasn't meant as payment for anything. Attached to that transaction was a message, 4 words that changed the entire dynamic. "We are ready to talk." Below that, a link, a method of contact, an invitation to communicate. The station that received the original ransom letter, when they later reviewed their records and disclosed this information publicly, made it clear that no one could definitively confirm who sent that February 10th message. But context allows us to make an educated assessment. In kidnapping cases, when someone puts money into a ransom account with a message saying they're ready to negotiate, that someone is typically either law enforcement or the victim's family. Think about the psychology of that moment. Someone, almost certainly the FBI or the Guthrie family working with the FBI, made a decision. They decided to engage. They decided to open a channel of communication. They put money into that account and sent a clear signal. We're here, we're listening, we're willing to talk. And then they waited for a response that never came. From February 10th until day 79, when this information was being discussed publicly, there had been 0 additional activity in that Bitcoin wallet. The message sat there, unread or ignored. The channel remained open, but silent. To understand why this matters, You need to understand how kidnapping negotiations actually work. And for that, we turn to someone who spent years conducting them. A retired FBI agent, identified in interviews as Steve, explained the strategic thinking behind that February 10th transaction. According to his analysis, ransom negotiations are fundamentally about power dynamics. On one side, kidnappers believe they hold all the leverage because they have something the family desperately wants returned. They operate under the assumption that parental love, desperation, and fear will force compliance with whatever demands they make. They think the emotional stakes are so high that the family has no choice but to surrender to their terms. But experienced negotiators see it differently. They understand that kidnappers also have something at stake. If their only potential victim is the person they're holding, and if that victim's family refuses to cooperate, then the kidnapper gets nothing. No money, no objective achieved, no purpose fulfilled, which means both sides are locked in what game theorists call a zero-sum situation. Either both sides get something, or nobody does. The FBI, when they choose to engage in negotiation, make this power dynamic explicit. They send a message, sometimes directly and sometimes through their actions, that says, "This isn't a situation where you make demands and we fulfill them. This is a negotiation." And in any negotiation, both parties have to give something to get something. The retired agent used an analogy that sounds almost callous until you understand the tactical necessity behind it. He compared it to negotiating the price of a house or a car. If you walk into that negotiation appearing desperate, appearing like you'll do anything to close the deal, the other side will not budge. They'll recognize they have the upper hand and push for maximum advantage. But if you demonstrate that while you're interested, you're also willing to walk away, suddenly there's room for actual negotiation. The same principle applies in kidnapping cases, but with infinitely higher stakes. Appearing desperate doesn't just cost you money. It can cost you leverage. It can cost you tactical advantage. And in worst-case scenarios, it can cost lives. So that February 10th message, small and simple as it was, carried enormous strategic weight. It said, "We're not going to play a game where you dictate all the terms. We're not going to let you control every aspect of this situation. We're willing to engage, but it's going to be a conversation, not a series of commands." And the kidnappers, if they were legitimate, if they truly had Nancy and truly wanted to negotiate her return, should have responded to that. They should have sent proof of life. They should have made a counter-offer. They should have engaged with the negotiation, but they didn't, which left investigators asking a question that would reshape the entire investigation. Why? One possibility is that the kidnappers were never serious about negotiation in the first place, that they were, as the retired FBI agent put it, operating in bad faith from day one. That means every communication, every demand, every piece of the ransom scenario was designed not to facilitate Nancy's return, but to create the appearance of a kidnapping while serving some other purpose entirely. Evidence supports this interpretation. Real kidnappers, ones genuinely interested in collecting ransom money, follow certain patterns. They provide proof of life because they understand that no rational person pays money for something without evidence it exists. They keep communications private because public attention brings law enforcement pressure and reduces their operational security. They negotiate because their objective is financial gain, and negotiation is how you maximize financial outcomes. None of that happened here. No proof of life was ever provided. Communications went through media channels, making everything public from the start. And when an opportunity for negotiation was presented through that Bitcoin wallet, it was met with silence. This brought investigators to an uncomfortable realization. If this wasn't a legitimate ransom situation, if the person who took Nancy never genuinely intended to negotiate her return for money, then what was it? To answer that question, they turned to behavioral analysis. Criminal profiling isn't the dramatic process depicted in movies and television shows. It's not about psychics having visions or detectives making wild intuitive leaps. It's about data, patterns, and statistics. It's about looking at thousands of solved cases and identifying the behavioral characteristics that appear repeatedly in specific types of crimes. Several retired FBI profilers examined the available information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, and one of the first data points they referenced wasn't even specific to this case. It was a statistic that comes up in almost every investigation involving violence against women. 92%. That's the percentage of women who are murdered, who are killed by someone they knew, not a stranger who selected them randomly, not someone who broke into their home without any prior connection, someone who had crossed paths with them before, someone who had some level of familiarity, some prior relationship, some reason to focus on that specific individual. Now, at this point in the investigation, Nancy Guthrie was still classified as missing, not confirmed dead. But profilers don't work in isolation from statistical reality. They understand that cases exist within broader patterns. And when you look at the circumstances of Nancy's disappearance through the lens of that 92% statistic, certain possibilities move to the forefront. If the person who took Nancy knew her, even peripherally, that changes the entire scope of the investigation. Because now you're not looking for a stranger who randomly selected a house in Tucson. You're looking for someone who had specific knowledge, someone who knew where she lived, someone who understood her routine, someone who felt confident enough in their familiarity with her situation to believe they could remove her without immediate detection. But here's where the definition becomes critical. When we say someone she knew, most people immediately think of close relationships, family members, intimate friends, neighbors she interacted with regularly. Those are the obvious connections that get examined first in any investigation. Profilers think more broadly. Someone a victim knew can include people in peripheral zones of their life. A contractor who performed work on their house years ago. A delivery person who came by regularly enough to establish pattern recognition. A technician who made service calls. Someone who worked at a store the victim visited frequently. Anyone who had repeated observational access. Anyone who had reason and opportunity to notice details about the victim's life. Most people don't maintain detailed memories of everyone they encounter. If you asked someone to list every service worker who had been in their home over the past 5 years, most couldn't do it. But the person providing that service, they remember the layout of your house. They remember your schedule. They remember if you live alone. They remember details you wouldn't think twice about sharing. This expanded definition dramatically increases the pool of potential suspects. It also makes the investigation exponentially more complex, because you're no longer just looking at people with obvious documented connections. You're trying to identify individuals who had access without necessarily having a close relationship. But profilers weren't just looking at who knew Nancy. They were analyzing behavior, trying to understand the psychological characteristics of whoever did this. And one word kept appearing in their assessments: unafraid. The person who took Nancy Guthrie, based on the evidence available, didn't act like someone paralyzed by fear of getting caught. They didn't display the hesitation or sloppiness that comes from panic. They moved with what appeared to be confidence. They executed a plan that required boldness. They took an 84-year-old woman from her home, and they did it in a way that suggested they believed they could succeed without being immediately identified. That kind of confidence typically comes from one of two sources. The first is experience. Someone who has done something similar before develops an understanding of risk. They know how to avoid leaving certain types of evidence. They know how to control situations. They know how much time they have before someone notices something is wrong. That knowledge breeds confidence because it's based on prior successful execution. The second source is obsession. When someone becomes so emotionally or psychologically invested in an objective that fear becomes secondary, they can act with extraordinary boldness. The goal becomes more important than the consequences. The need to complete the act overrides the instinct for self-preservation. Either possibility is deeply concerning. Experience suggests someone who might have harmed others. Obsession suggests someone whose psychological investment in this specific victim or situation could lead to unpredictable behavior. What made investigators increasingly uneasy was another behavioral characteristic that emerged from the evidence. Whoever did this appeared to understand how investigations work. They seemed to anticipate how law enforcement would respond. The ransom scenario, despite being executed in unusual ways, showed awareness of investigative procedures. That level of sophistication doesn't come from nowhere. It suggests either someone with direct knowledge of law enforcement operations or someone who had studied cases extensively enough to understand patterns. And when you combine sophistication with confidence, you get someone who isn't just acting impulsively. You get someone who is planning, strategizing, constructing a narrative, which brings us back to that ransom. If the person who took Nancy was intelligent enough to anticipate investigative responses, bold enough to execute an abduction, and sophisticated enough to create a complex scenario, why did they make the ransom public? Because there's one thing every expert agreed on. Sending those ransom letters to television stations was not standard criminal behavior. Real kidnappers seeking financial gain want privacy. They want to control the flow of information. They want to limit the number of people involved in the situation because every additional person represents another potential point of failure, another chance for law enforcement to gather intelligence, another risk to their operational security. But this kidnapper, if that's what they were, did the opposite. They ensured media coverage. They guaranteed public attention. They created a scenario where privacy was impossible. The retired FBI agent who discussed the case stated it plainly. If you wanted an intermediary to pass along information, you could choose people other than the media. There are private channels. There are neutral third parties. There are ways to communicate without broadcasting your demands to the world. The fact that these letters went to TV stations wasn't accidental. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to make this situation public, which forces a disturbing question. What if the publicity was the point? What if media attention wasn't a side effect of the ransom, but the actual objective? Because if that's true, then everything shifts. You're no longer looking at someone trying to collect money who made strange tactical choices. You're looking at someone who wanted to create a public event, someone who wanted attention, spectacle, exposure. And if attention was the goal, then the natural next question becomes, attention from whom? That question led investigators to reconsider who the real target might be. Nancy Guthrie is an 84-year-old private citizen living in Tucson. She doesn't have the kind of public profile that would make her the target of someone seeking attention through criminal acts. But her daughter does. Savannah Guthrie appears on national television every weekday morning. She interviews presidents, covers breaking news, and has a professional presence that reaches millions of viewers. That kind of visibility creates something most people never experience. Exposure to strangers who develop feelings, opinions, and perceptions about you without ever having met you. Most of that attention is benign. People watch. They form preferences about anchors and reporters. They move on with their lives. But occasionally, someone crosses a line. They don't just watch, they fixate. They build elaborate mental constructs about who this person is, what they represent, what their relationship might be if circumstances were different. Psychologists who study parasocial relationships, the one-sided connections people form with media personalities, understand that most of these remain harmless fantasy. But in rare cases, that fixation evolves into something darker. The person begins to interpret comments, segments, or professional decisions as personally directed at them. They read meaning into things that were never intended. They construct narratives where none exist. And if something triggers them, if they perceive an insult or a slight or a betrayal from this person they've built up in their mind, that fixation can transform into resentment, into anger, into a desire for revenge, based not on reality but on perception. Investigators began looking at the case through that lens. What if Nancy wasn't the ultimate target? What if she was the path to reaching someone else? What if taking an 84-year-old woman was never about that specific woman, but about sending a message to her daughter? Because if you want to hurt someone in the public eye, someone who has security and professional protections, someone you can't easily access directly, you look for vulnerability. And for many people, that vulnerability is family. Taking Nancy would force Savannah into a nightmare scenario where her private tragedy became public spectacle, where her mother's disappearance played out in media coverage, where she had to continue appearing on television every morning while knowing her mother was missing. That psychological torture, that forced exposure of private pain in a public forum, could be exactly what someone seeking revenge might want. Not money, not negotiation, just the act itself. Just the ability to cause that specific kind of suffering. This theory would explain the public nature of the ransom. If your goal is to maximize attention, to ensure the target sees what you've done, to force the situation into the spotlight, you don't send private messages. You go through channels that guarantee coverage. You make it impossible to ignore. It would also explain the lack of follow-through on the ransom demands. Because if money was never the actual objective, then negotiation doesn't matter. The act itself is the message. Taking Nancy is the communication. Everything after that, the ransom letters, the Bitcoin wallet, the demands, those might have been theater, a constructed narrative designed to make the crime look like something it wasn't. But if that's true, then the silence after that February 10th Bitcoin message makes a horrible kind of sense. Because someone motivated by revenge, someone who wanted to send a message rather than collect payment, wouldn't respond to negotiation attempts. They would have already achieved what they set out to do. The act was complete. The message was delivered. The suffering was inflicted. There's no resolution to seek, because from their perspective, the situation resolved the moment Nancy disappeared. This interpretation is deeply unsettling because it means you're not dealing with someone who wants something you can provide. You're dealing with someone who already took what they wanted. And that makes them almost impossible to negotiate with, because there's nothing left to negotiate. Of course, all of this remains theoretical. Investigators were building profiles based on behavior and evidence. But profiles don't identify specific suspects. They narrow the field. They provide direction. They help investigators understand what kind of person they might be looking for. And as day 79 came and went, as the Bitcoin wallet remained silent, as no new communications emerged, the investigation found itself in a difficult position. Because every theory they developed, every profile they constructed, led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. If this was about money, the lack of proof of life, and the public ransom make no sense. If this was about revenge, the ransom scenario itself makes no sense. If this was about sending a message, the silence after the message was delivered makes perfect sense, but offers no path forward. The only thing investigators knew with certainty was that an 84-year-old woman was missing, that her family had been waiting nearly 3 months for answers, that somewhere, someone knew what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and that person, for reasons that remained frustratingly unclear, had chosen silence over negotiation, mystery over resolution. The case would continue, new information would emerge, and investigators would keep searching for the piece that made everything else fall into place. Because in the end, every question they were asking, every theory they were building, every profile they were developing, all of it came back to one fundamental mystery. What happened to Nancy Guthrie? And why? If this kind of investigative analysis interests you, if you want to follow cases where the evidence challenges expectations and every answer creates new questions, then make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vic. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue following this case and others like it, because this story isn't over, and what comes next might finally provide the answers everyone has been searching for. When an investigation reaches a certain point, when all the interviews have been conducted and all the obvious leads have been followed, the case begins to live in a different space, not abandoned, not forgotten, but waiting for something concrete, something that doesn't rely on interpretation or theory, something physical, something real. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, after 79 days of questions without answers, investigators found themselves searching for exactly that. Because behavioral analysis can only take you so far, profiles can narrow the field, theories can guide your direction, but at the end of the day, You need evidence. And evidence doesn't come from patterns or possibilities. It comes from scenes, from spaces where something happened and someone left a trace behind. So investigators went back to the beginning, back to Nancy's home in Tucson, back to the bedroom where an 84-year-old woman was last known to be before she vanished. And they searched not for the obvious, but for the invisible. Because the most important evidence in modern investigations isn't always what you can see with the naked eye. It's what you can only detect under magnification, under specialized light, under conditions that reveal what was missed the first time. And that's when they found it. Not a weapon, not a note, not a clear signature of violence. They found something far smaller, a single strand of hair. On its own, it doesn't look like much. It's the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. The kind of thing that gets swept away without a second thought. But in the context of a missing person investigation, in a bedroom where someone disappeared, that single strand becomes everything. Because hair doesn't just appear randomly. It comes from a person. And if that person can be identified, if that strand can be traced back to someone who shouldn't have been in that room, then suddenly you're not working with theories anymore. You're working with connections. But here's where it gets complicated. Because finding hair at a scene is one thing. Using it to identify someone is something else entirely. If you're following cases like this, if you want to understand how evidence moves from collection to conclusion, then you're in the right place. This is True Crime Vic, where we break down the investigative process, the forensic science, and the strategic decisions that shape how these cases unfold. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next with this evidence could change everything. Hair analysis has evolved significantly over the past few decades. In older cases, before DNA technology became standard, hair could only provide limited information. Analysts could examine characteristics like color, thickness, and texture. They could sometimes determine whether it came from a human or an animal, whether it showed signs of treatment or damage, but they couldn't tell you definitively who it came from. That limitation left countless cases stalled, waiting for technology to catch up to the questions investigators needed answered. Then DNA analysis changed everything. Because if a hair includes the root, the follicle, the cellular material at the base where it was attached to the scalp, then it contains DNA. And DNA can be compared against databases, against known individuals, against family members to build genealogical connections. It can take an anonymous strand and give it an identity. But not all hair comes with that root attached. Sometimes what you find is just the shaft, the part that doesn't contain the same level of genetic material. And when that happens, the analysis becomes more challenging. Not impossible, but limited. You can extract mitochondrial DNA from the shaft, which provides some information, but it's not as precise as nuclear DNA from the root. It can point you toward a maternal lineage, but it can't always give you a specific individual. So when investigators found that strand in Nancy's bedroom, the first question wasn't just who does this belong to, it was what kind of analysis is possible with what we have. And that question would determine how valuable this evidence could actually be. According to information that emerged about the investigation, that hair was sent to a laboratory for initial testing. Standard procedures were followed. Analysts examined what they had, determined what could be extracted, and began the process of building a genetic profile. But then something else happened. Something that suggested investigators believed this evidence warranted more than standard analysis. The hair was sent to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, and that decision tells you something significant. Because Quantico isn't where routine evidence goes. It's where complex cases go. Cases that require advanced techniques, specialized expertise, methods that push beyond what typical forensic labs can provide. The FBI has access to technology and databases that aren't universally available. They can perform tests that are newer, more experimental, more precise. So the fact that this hair made its way to Quantico indicates that investigators saw potential in it. They believed it could lead somewhere. They believed it was worth pursuing with every available resource. But even with that commitment, There are limitations, because DNA analysis, as powerful as it is, isn't instantaneous. It requires time, it requires careful processing, and it requires something to compare the results against. If the DNA extracted from that hair matches someone already in a criminal database, if it connects to a person with a prior arrest or conviction, then identification can happen relatively quickly. The system finds the match, flags the connection, and investigators have a name. But if there's no direct match, if the DNA belongs to someone who has never been entered into those systems, then the process becomes more complex. That's where genetic genealogy comes in. It's a technique that has solved cold cases that seemed unsolvable. It works by taking DNA from an unknown source and comparing it against public genealogy databases, the kind that people use to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. When partial matches appear, analysts can build family trees, working backward through generations to identify common ancestors, and then forward through descendants to narrow down who the DNA might belong to. It's painstaking work. It requires collaboration between forensic scientists and genealogists. It involves researching family histories, tracking down records, eliminating possibilities one by one until you arrive at a viable suspect. And it takes time, weeks, sometimes months. But when it works, it doesn't just give you a suspect. It gives you context. It shows you how that person fits into a larger network of relationships, where they came from, who they're connected to. And in a case like Nancy Guthrie's, where the theory has centered on someone who knew her, even peripherally, that kind of contextual information could be exactly what's needed. Because it's not just about identifying a name. It's about understanding how that name connects to the victim, what access they had, what opportunity existed, what possible motive might have driven them to act. But even as this forensic work continues, even as investigators wait for results that could reshape the entire case, there's still the question of interpretation. Because finding someone's hair at a scene doesn't automatically mean they're responsible for what happened there. Hair can transfer in ways that have nothing to do with criminal activity. It can attach to clothing and be carried from one location to another. It can be present in a space for innocent reasons that have nothing to do with the crime itself. So even if this strand leads to a specific individual, investigators will still need to ask another question. Why was it there? And the answer to that question will depend on context. If the hair belongs to someone who had legitimate access to Nancy's home, someone who had been there before for reasons unrelated to her disappearance, then its presence might not mean much. But if it belongs to someone who has no explainable reason to be in that bedroom, someone who can't account for how their DNA ended up in that specific location, then it becomes far more significant. And that's where the behavioral analysis and the physical evidence start to converge. Because if the DNA connects to someone who also fits the profile that's been developed, someone whose behavior, background, or connection to Savannah Guthrie aligns with the theories investigators have been building, then you're no longer looking at isolated pieces of information. You're looking at a pattern that points in one direction. But we're not there yet. As of the information available publicly, those results haven't been disclosed. The testing is ongoing, or completed, but not released, which means the investigation remains in that waiting space, that place between possibility and proof. And while investigators wait for science to provide answers, they continue working other angles, examining other aspects of the case that don't rely on lab results. One of those aspects is the pattern of behavior around the ransom itself, because the more time passes, the more unusual that entire sequence becomes. Real kidnappings, ones where the perpetrator genuinely intends to exchange the victim for money, follow predictable patterns. There's initial contact, there's a demand, there's negotiation, there's proof of life, there's escalating pressure designed to keep the victim's family emotionally engaged and willing to comply. None of that happened here. The initial contact came through media outlets, not private channels. The demand was vague, not specific. The negotiation never materialized, despite an attempt to open communication through that Bitcoin wallet. And most tellingly, there was never any proof of life. No photograph, no video, No audio recording. No personal detail that only Nancy would know. Nothing that confirmed she was alive and in the custody of whoever was making demands. That absence is critical, because providing proof of life is kidnapping negotiation 101. It's the baseline requirement for establishing credibility. Without it, there's no reason for a family to believe cooperation will lead to the victim's return. And experienced kidnappers understand that. They know that families, especially families working with law enforcement, won't just hand over money based on a claim. They need evidence. So the fact that no proof of life was ever offered suggests one of two possibilities. Either the person making the ransom demands was inexperienced, didn't understand how these situations work, and made a critical error that undermined their entire objective, or they never actually intended to return Nancy, which means the ransom was never real in the first place. That second possibility is the one that keeps resurfacing in the analysis of this case. Because if the ransom was theatre, if it was a constructed narrative designed to make the crime look like something it wasn't, then the lack of follow-through makes sense. You don't need to negotiate if negotiation was never the goal. You don't need to provide proof of life if the victim's return was never part of the plan. You just need to create enough confusion, enough distraction, enough misdirection to buy time and distance. Time for what? That's the question that leads to the darkest theory in this case. Time to complete whatever the actual objective was. And if that objective wasn't ransom, if it wasn't negotiation, if it wasn't about getting something from the family, then it might have been something far more final, something that happened before the ransom letters were ever sent, something that the ransom was designed to obscure. Investigators don't reach that conclusion lightly. It's not a theory you build from speculation. It's a theory you arrive at when the evidence, the behavior, and the timeline all point in the same direction. And in this case, they do. The physical evidence at the scene reportedly suggested that Nancy's safety wasn't prioritized. The ransom communication didn't follow legitimate patterns. The silence that followed the February 10th Bitcoin message wasn't the silence of someone waiting to negotiate. It was the silence of someone who had already accomplished what they set out to do. And if that's true, if Nancy was never being held for ransom, if her disappearance was about something other than money, then the investigation shifts from rescue to recovery, from negotiation to prosecution, from hoping for the best to preparing for the worst. That shift changes the strategic focus, because now investigators aren't just looking for someone who took Nancy. They're looking for someone who might have harmed her. And that person, based on everything the behavioral analysis suggests, is likely someone connected to her life in some way. Someone who had access, opportunity, and a motive that had nothing to do with financial gain, which brings the investigation back, once again, to the question of Savannah. Because if this wasn't about Nancy as an individual, if it was about Nancy as a connection point, then understanding who might target her means understanding who might have fixated on her daughter. And that pool of potential suspects becomes extraordinarily difficult to navigate. Public figures exist in a strange space. They interact with millions of people they'll never meet. They become familiar to strangers who watch them every morning, who hear their voice, who develop opinions and feelings about them without any reciprocal relationship. And most of that attention is harmless. Most people understand the boundary between public persona and private individual. They watch, they listen, they form preferences, and they move on with their lives. But there are exceptions. People who don't see that boundary. People who construct elaborate mental narratives where they have a personal connection to someone they've only seen on television. People who interpret comments, segments, or professional decisions as directed specifically at them. People who build resentment based on perceived slights that never actually occurred. And when that fixation reaches a certain intensity, when perception becomes divorced from reality, those individuals can act in ways that don't follow rational logic, because their motivation isn't grounded in facts. It's grounded in emotion, in imagination, in a constructed reality that exists only in their mind. And in that reality, actions that would seem incomprehensible to everyone else make perfect sense to them. If someone like that decided to act, If they decided to move from fixation to action, they might not target the public figure directly. Security, visibility, professional protections. All of those factors make direct contact difficult. But family members, especially elderly family members living private lives away from that protective infrastructure, they become vulnerable in a way the public figure isn't. And taking a family member accomplishes something that targeting the public figure directly never could. It forces private pain into public view. It creates suffering that can't be hidden or managed or controlled. And if that was the objective, if causing that specific kind of anguish was the goal, then negotiation was never necessary. The act itself was the message. Taking Nancy, making it public, forcing Savannah to experience her mother's disappearance while the world watched, that might have been the entire point. And once that point was made, there was nothing left to do but disappear into silence. This theory explains the pattern. It explains the public nature of the ransom. It explains the lack of follow-through. It explains why someone would create a scenario that looks like kidnapping, but doesn't behave like one. Because it was never about kidnapping. It was about revenge, about obsession, about perception-based grievance that no one else would understand. But theories, no matter how compelling, aren't enough. They need to be supported by evidence. They need to connect to something real, something provable. And that's why the hair found in Nancy's bedroom matters so much. Because if it connects to someone who fits this profile, someone with a documented fixation on Savannah, someone whose background suggests obsessive behavior, someone who can't explain why their DNA was in that room, then theory becomes case. Speculation becomes prosecution. We're waiting for that connection, waiting for forensic science to bridge the gap between what investigators believe happened and what they can prove. And while that wait continues, the case exists in a space of uncertainty, not cold, not forgotten, but unresolved. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for months now. Her family continues to search for answers. Law enforcement continues to follow every lead, test every piece of evidence, pursue every possibility. And somewhere, potentially in a database, potentially in a genealogy chart, potentially in test results that haven't been made public yet, there might be the answer that changes everything. Because cases like this don't always stay mysteries forever. Sometimes the piece that solves them was there all along, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be tested with the right technology, waiting for the moment when everything clicks into place. And when that moment comes, when the DNA results provide a name, when that name connects to a motive, when investigators can finally answer not just what happened, but who was responsible, this case will move from the realm of theory into the realm of justice. Until then, we're left with questions. What happened to Nancy Guthrie? Was she taken by someone motivated by ransom? Or by something darker? Was she targeted because of who she was? Or because of who her daughter is? Was the ransom real or a distraction? Is she still alive somewhere? Or did this case become something far more tragic before anyone realized? Those questions don't have public answers yet, but investigators are working toward them. The evidence is being processed, the leads are being followed, and the truth, whatever it is, still exists. It exists in that strand of hair. It exists in the behavioral patterns of whoever did this. It exists in the connections that haven't been fully uncovered yet, and it exists in the mind of the person responsible. Someone who knows exactly what happened. Someone who made the decisions that led to an 84-year-old woman vanishing from her home. Someone who created a ransom scenario that was never meant to succeed. Someone who walked away into silence believing they had gotten away with it. But silence doesn't last forever. Evidence has a way of surfacing. DNA has a way of connecting. Mistakes have a way of compounding over time. And cases that seem impossible to solve sometimes break open when a single piece of information, a single test result, a single connection finally emerges. This case isn't over. It's not resolved, but it's not abandoned either. And for everyone following it, for everyone who wants to understand how these investigations work, how evidence is processed, how theories are built and tested and refined, this is where we are, waiting for science, waiting for answers, waiting for the moment when everything that has been speculation becomes certainty. If you want to stay updated on this case, and others like it, if you want to understand the investigative process and the forensic science that drives modern criminal investigations, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vic. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue following the Nancy Guthrie case and the search for answers that has now stretched across months of investigation, analysis, and waiting. Because when those answers finally come, when the evidence provides the clarity everyone has been searching for, we'll be here to break down exactly what it means and where the case goes from there.